Hi everyone, I'm Sylvie from HR.com and I'll be your webcast host today. Welcome to Why Well-Being in the Workplace Matters for Organizational Performance and How to Improve It, sponsored by the Myers-Briggs Company and presented by Rachel Cubas-Wilkinson and Rich Thompson. This webcast has been pre-approved for one HRCI and one SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them in there. And it's now my pleasure to turn you over to today's presenters.
Hi, thank you, Sylvie. This is Kim Rivera, Marketing Manager at the Myers-Briggs Company. And before we begin, I'd like to highlight that we'll be reserving the last 10 minutes for Q&A. So please submit your questions at any time through the Q&A function in the webinar controls, and we'll be asking those questions to our presenters then. I'm going to hand it over to Rachel and Rich now.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everybody to the session. We're going to basically use this title slide as kind of the agenda or the sequence of what we'll cover. So if you're wondering what the next hour or so will be like, we're going to be looking at well-being in the workplace, kind of the why behind it first, and then we're going to look specifically at how it affects organizational performance, and then we're going to be ending out the session with some tips on how you might go about improving your personal well-being or organizational well-being. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. My colleague and I will be presenting, kind of tag teaming, so just to kind of put a face to a name here. My name is Dr. Rachel Cubas-Wilkinson. I lead the consultancy services team for the Myers-Briggs Company, which basically just means I get to partner with organizations large and small to solve people development challenges. I have a background mostly in organizational leadership and change, and also in adult learning. And I'd like to ask my colleague, Rich, if he'd like to introduce himself briefly at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you very much for being here. As Rachel said, my name is Rich Thompson. I'm the Director of Global Research at the Myers-Briggs Company. I've been here for quite a while. I've done a lot of work globally with most of our instruments, including the MBTI, the TKI, FIRO, CPI, and Strong. I have master's and PhD's degree in IO psychology from Texas Tech. I've been working in this area for about 25 or 30 years now. I've lost track. But again, thanks for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thanks so much, Rich. I wish we had time to hear a little bit about you guys, but I think we just might along the way. We're going to try to keep this a little bit interactive. There'll be times where we'll ask you to use the Q&A tab to share your thoughts, as well as that Q&A time at the end. So I wanted to kick off here with just saying, you know, the mission of the Myers-Briggs Company is very simple. It's to inspire everyone to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. And I think this fits really well with the theme that we're discussing today, with this idea of well-being, of employee engagement. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore well-being specifically as it relates to the workplace, how it connects, in what ways it connects to the world of work, and really ultimately how we can help individuals and the individuals within the organization be able to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. So first of all, why well-being? And that first question, I'm addressing it for the Myers-Briggs Company in particular. Certainly as a company, we're interested in employee well-being, but there was a set of questions that were posed to us that really launched us into a deeper dive into research around well-being in the workplace and how it affects us. So about 4 years ago, the CEO of a health insurance company asked one of our consultants a question, and he said, please help us measure if our staff are happy. And it was these questions that became intriguing questions that the consultant couldn't shake and started these 4 years of research into well-being. And what we quickly realized at the time is that getting to answers around, are our employees happy? Is our staff happy? And what affects their happiness at work was going to take more than a single question, more than a single survey, and more than simply a question of, are you happy? Or how happy are you? And so we'll explore the depth of what well-being really is in just a few moments here. There's quite a bit of a well-being boom, I think, that's happening right now. And there's a few reasons that we're going to dive into for why that might be the case. So one is this idea of time. In a lifetime, we're going to spend about 90,000 hours, up to half of our waking hours spent at work. For some of you, if you love what you do, maybe that's still concerning, but if you don't love what you do, if your workplace does not lend itself to promoting your well-being, that might actually be quite a scary figure to think about. Another sort of construct to look at is duration. So there's more research to show that we're living longer and that this next generation that's coming up, when they enter the workplace, it's not going to be surprising for them to actually be employees for 80 or more years of their lifetime. So that means the world of work is becoming more relevant for a longer period of time for us. There's also a growing expectation on the employee side that we don't just want to survive. We don't just want to show up at a job, in a transactional kind of way for a paycheck or some kind of reward. We actually have an expectation that is growing in employees for organizations to help me thrive as an employee, to help invest in employees. If these reasons alone weren't enough, and we'll look at a few more in just a moment, let's put some cost figures to it. So for example, work-related stress is an area where organizations lose $300 billion each year. The cost of disengagement at work, a lot of Gallup work on this, for example, that you can dive into, you've probably seen before, $550 billion is the cost of employee disengagement at work. These are by the Global Welness Institute. So there's a tremendous amount of association between well-being and employee engagement. There's also a few other sort of factors that we have to contend with. So for example, we're going through as a workforce a rapid period of change with globalization, with technological advances, with AI. There's a constant change that's happening, internal factors that make organizations complex, external factors that happen to organizations or that change the rules of the game, so to speak. Also moving towards virtual working environments. There's research that shows that there's now more communication happening virtually than face-to-face, even in co-located teams. And what all of these dramatic changes are doing is, at least one of the end results, is it's requiring that employees become adaptable, that they still figure out ways to constantly learn, to constantly collaborate, even in the midst of tremendous change. And also even in the midst of quite a bit of workplace stress. The reality is that organizations expect employees to have high levels of learning, of collaboration, and adaptability. And all of these things, from a standpoint of showing up to work, require that our well-being be addressed, require higher levels of well-being. In other words, ask yourself, how much can I be adaptable, collaborative, and eager to constantly learn and grow if my well-being, my most basic of needs, are hurting or are low? This is, I think, a really good time to ask yourself the question, or to ask ourselves the question, what is the cost not of addressing well-being for employees, but of not addressing employee well-being, given some of these realities that we've seen? There's a few more interesting dynamics that I think I'll point out here. One is this idea that we're seeing the well-being bloom on a global scale. So we're seeing things like the World Happiness Report, right? Where we all pull this up and we all check to see what number we are, who's number one, who's in the top three, who's in the bottom three. So this idea of well-being or happiness is become a construct that we're now seeking to measure. And that idea is making the concept of well-being something more palpable, something that people are trying to strive for, because if you can measure it, that means you can improve it. And so there's a lot of investment now happening organizationally in well-being. In fact, the workplace well-being market is at about $40 billion. But interestingly, if you look at all of those dollars, they're all being spent on only 9% of the global workforce, which tells you a few things. One, it tells you we need to really start looking at ways of figuring out how those $40 billion are helping employee well-being or not. And the second thing we need to do is we need to expand that 9%, because it's not 9% of the global workforce that needs well-being, right? It's all of us. And then again, this idea that employers supporting the well-being of staff is slowly becoming the norm, not the exception. With globalization, with talent that can really go from one job at one company anywhere in the world to another, there's opportunities now for employees to ask an employer during an interview process or during the vetting process, what are you doing for employee well-being? And for them to make some pretty critical decisions about choosing to work at that place of employment or choosing to move on to something else based on the level of investment that the organization is willing to make into employee well-being. And I think it's for good reason that organizations are beginning to make these investments. Perhaps what some of our organizations are beginning to discover is that there's a two-way relationship between well-being and the world of work. Take, for example, the idea that lower well-being associates in the research with feeling unmotivated and disengaged at work. Remember that figure of $550 billion lost to employee disengagement each year. And then on the flip side, higher well-being associates with motivation and fulfillment at work. I think I'd be hard-pressed in my consulting role to ask a leader if they have all of their employees at a level of personal motivation and fulfillment that the organization wants. In most cases, they would tell me, you know what, we could actually use a little bit more of that. And it turns out well-being is associated with it. In fact, there's research that shows that well-being influences a broad spectrum of things, from health to relationships, all the way to our creativity and even things like income. There's also some growing research that is showing how companies sponsoring well-being efforts are actually demonstrating gains on the return of their investment. So for example, this research study showed that companies sponsoring employee well-being outperformed the stock market 3-1 in a period from 2000 to 2014. A very interesting statistic there. There's also a lot of evidence that shows that well-being is very much connected to our job performance. In fact, all of these research studies all estimate how much of our job performance at work comes solely from our well-being. And it's estimated that as much as 1/3 of employee performance could be due just to well-being. So if you had any ability to influence 1/3 of your employees' performance on the job, well-being would be an interesting place to make some investments. And then here's these interesting statistics. When people have a good day of work, what we're seeing here is that well-being is not only tied to work performance, but that higher well-being leads to better job performance. There's evidence to show that when we have a good day at work, we're 28% more productive. We're 31% more creative and 70% more likely to recommend their organization or our organization as a good place to work, which sort of begs this question, and I'll invite you to think about it. What would be the impact to your organization's mission and to the ultimate success of your organization if you experienced 28% increased productivity, 31% increased creativity, and 70% more people out there saying, hey, come work here, come work at this place. This is a good place to work. So let's pause there. I think what we've done there is we've taken a very broad look at why well-being matters in the workplace, some of the factors that it might impact. And now what I want to do is I want to do a little bit of a self-reflection exercise. This is the part where what we're going to do is we're going to show you 6 questions that relate to well-being. I'm going to invite you to pick one of those questions, and right where you are at your desk, at home, at work, go ahead and maybe write down some reflective thoughts. So pick the question that resonates with you the most at this time, write down some thoughts, and in a moment, I'm going to ask for volunteers who might be willing to share a portion of what they wrote that they would be willing to share with us so that we can explore some of your answers on each of these. So again, I'm going to walk you through 6 questions, but you're only picking one. Question number 1 is, think of the last situation you felt sustained positive emotion at work, something like joy, cheerfulness, happiness, amusement, or awe. How did it affect your work? Option number 2 is you could answer, think of a person that you have a positive relationship with at work. What makes it positive for you? Or you might answer, think of a time when you thoroughly enjoyed a work activity that used your strengths and your talents. What was that like for you? Option 4, think of a role or an activity that you undertake at work that gives you a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose? How does it help you and others? 2 more. Number 5 is think of something you do that gives you a sense of achievement at work. How does this achievement make you feel? And the last question that you can choose from, when did you last feel a strong negative emotion at work? Perhaps felt angry, depressed, anxious, or dejected, and how did this affect your work? So again, look at these, pick one that resonates for you, and I'm gonna put a little bit of a counter for myself here, and in about 30 seconds, we're gonna invite you one by one in terms of the questions. We're gonna invite folks to share whatever part of your answer you're comfortable with sharing in the Q&A tab. Go ahead and pick a question now, and you're gonna hear about 30 seconds of silence while you do this self-reflection. Okay, that was about 20 seconds or so, but the silence is so deafening, isn't it? So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna step in, and here's what I'd like you to do. If you selected question 1, go ahead and chat into the Q&A tab of your screen, whatever portion of your answer that you're comfortable with. Maybe it's a word, maybe it's a phrase, whatever you're comfortable sharing. We just wanna hear from you, make sure you're out there, make sure that somebody's engaging with these questions in particular. And Rich, if you would, I'd love for you to maybe let us know if you're seeing stuff come in, just in case nobody chose question 1.
Yeah, Rachel, that's fine. Let me see if I can get into it now. So far, I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, it looks like we just had one come in.
Yep. Here they come. So for question 1, I really brought my whole self to the project at hand.
I love that.
So that's when they were feeling good. Another comment is I just worked harder. Another one is I felt more energized to complete my other work tasks. I'm not sure with which of those questions that's associated.
That is perfect. Let's go to question number 2. If you selected question number 2, go ahead and give us the part of your answer that you're comfortable sharing.
While we're waiting, one more on question 1. When I finished a project single-handedly, it was a huge responsibility and I felt empowered, which is great.
Very nice. I'll go ahead and I'll make the call now for question 3. So just mark your answer, just put a 2 or a 3 and give us the part of your answer that you're willing to share with us.
For question 2, I have a close friend who's always ready to assist me at work, which is a great example of relationships. Also for 2, person makes me feel valued. He likes my ideas, values my contribution. Our ideas build off each other because we are comfortable sharing. It's a safe place to brainstorm, which is also a great relationship.
Yeah, I love that.
And another one on 2 is a mutual positive relationship.
Oh, I love this one. My boss is very flexible and I enjoy that part of our relationship. Let's go ahead and let's open up questions 4 and 5. Just put the number and put the part of the answer that you're willing to share with us. This is kind of like boarding an airline, group 1, group 2, group 3. If anybody selected questions 3, 4, or 5, go ahead and mark yours and share that with us now.
We have one for 3, which says, last week I was able to use more than one of my strengths, which elevated my feelings of performance and achieving quite a bit. Great. Another person wrote, Katie wrote, I love the feeling of identifying and catching errors and inconsistencies through data analysis. I can appreciate that.
Mhm.
For number 4, Stephanie says being a consultant for people, managers on how they can facilitate challenging conversations. She finds value in that. For number 5, we have one that says, I'm bilingual, and so when I use my Spanish skills to assist an employee, it really gives me a sense of accomplishment. Also for number 5, I provide personal development coaching for managers, helping them have a developmental aha moment, which we like to see. It feels great when I'm able to impact them making a personal progress.
Nice. And the final question, did anybody pick question number 6? Anybody brave enough to share a little bit there with us?
I have one, I won't name names. I have been criticized, shamed, and punished, which makes me feel afraid and looking to hide out to avoid this manager.
That's to be expected, right? That's very challenging.
Another number 6, I got really angry when I wasn't openly communicated to about problems with team members were facing with me. I felt left out and it affected my concentration.
Interesting how it steals your focus that way.
And another one from number 6, I felt devalued and dejected. I stayed in my office. It caused additional stress, which ultimately left me leaving that organization.
Ooh.
A great example of something we'll talk about in a little bit. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you everybody for being brave and sharing some of those answers with us. This is a start to a little bit of the checking your own well-being that you might be able to do on some of this session. Now, why did we ask you these 6 questions? I'll just kind of recap this very, very quickly, but each one of them actually maps to an aspect of well-being. What we've done as the Myers-Briggs Company is we took the work of Martin Seligman that is really profound work that came out in 2011 after 15 or so years of research that he had done originally on learned optimism and happiness, a work that received quite a lot of notable attention, and it was actually commissioned in every type of organization from schools for student well-being to the US military for psychological fitness, all the way to the Australian government for building well-being in the population and the community. But it turns out that each of these questions maps to a specific aspect of well-being. So the first thing to think about here is that well-being is, you can look at this format, these 6 things, as kind of like a dashboard. The dashboard of your car has many different dials that all together show you a little bit about the health of the car, how the car is doing, and there's no one dial that you can look at to tell you how the car is doing. Similarly, well-being, there's no one particular aspect that 100% accounts for or equates well-being. Instead, there's this increasing research that shows that it's a compendium of factors, and that when these factors are enhanced, it leads to a range of outcomes in our lives personally and professionally as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually dive into each one of these very, very briefly. I'm just going to give you kind of a brief description of what they all are, even though some of them, I think the language is clear enough that we understand it from our normal vernacular, but we'll look at each one. And then that's going to set the stage for what my colleague Rich is going to do, because he's going to walk you through some of the very interesting research that we have found across each of these dynamics. So let's start with the first one, positive emotions. First of all, I'm experiencing positive emotions just looking at this picture right now, but it's about having frequent feelings of happiness, of contentment, of pleasure. This associates to the very first question that we asked you. Positive emotions such as happiness, pleasure, satisfaction, joy, or really just general happiness are included here. Now, even though being happy is important, it's not enough for our well-being, but it is a part of it. In fact, research has discovered that positive emotions contribute to your success in relationships, in work, and in health, rather than these things producing positive emotions. So very, very interesting. The next one is relationships. Relationships concern this mutual feeling of caring, of support, and of satisfaction with others. This associates with question 2 that we offered you. The positive relationships are where the positive aspects outnumber the negative aspects. Obviously, we all know that relationships, because they're worth it, there are often times that we experience negative aspects of them, But in this particular case, the positive aspects greatly outnumber the negative ones. It leaves us with a sort of sense of mutual feelings of care, of support, and of satisfaction with the relationships that we have. Think here about the Gallup research that shows that if you have a best friend at work, there's two things that happen. One, you're more likely to be engaged at work, very interesting. And number two, you're more likely to have engaged customers. So if you think of the crosswalk to an employee engaging customers, relationships at work are actually part of that dynamic. Then there's engagement. Engagement is about this deep psychological connection and you becoming absorbed in an activity or cause. This associates with the third question that we asked you, and I hope you can all sort of think of a time where you're doing something, you're involved in an activity or you're involved in an organization, and it's just as though time disappears. And you find this idea of flow, and you become immersed and become concentrated on this intrinsically motivating task, be it an experiment, playing music, doing playing some kind of a sport or programming. These are the moments that really cause you to become fully engaged with the present moment. Things like, multitasking and distractions and things in time and those constraints sort of fade away a little bit. Think of some of the things that you do that really give you an opportunity to find flow. And research indicates for employees that the single greatest indicator of engagement in the workplace is employees being able to do what they do best. So imagine giving work activities to somebody where they can find that flow and become immersed with their strengths and their talents. This next one is meaning. Meaning is all about a sense of purpose, a sense of direction. This was related to the fourth question that we gave you, and it involves feeling connected to something bigger than oneself, having direction in life. And what we know from a psychological standpoint about meaning is that meaning helps us during those extremely difficult hardships of life, meaning that if we perceive ourselves as having a meaningful life, that is a source of satisfaction, a source of strength, a source of energy in times of hardship. Whereas if we perceive ourselves to be having a meaningless life, that in itself is an ordeal, even without any kind of hardship. And then let's look at accomplishment. This associates with the fifth question that we looked at if you picked question number 5. And this is all about pursuing success or mastery for its own sake. It's about, regardless of whether it brings you positive emotions, engagement, relationships, or meaning, you're seeking achievement, you're seeking progress, you're seeking mastery. And think here of all of the millions of people across the world who join contests or marathons to achieve outcomes that don't really have, a financial reward or any other incentive beyond simply being engaged in it, beyond simply participating in it. And people go to great lengths to set personal goals around these areas and be able to beat their own personal goals at these kinds of things. There's interesting research around accomplishment that shows that a mindset of achievement is actually twice as important than IQ in predicting student academic performance. So think about that even as it relates to adult learning in the workplace. And then this one, the last one that we want to look at, this factor of low negative emotions was not part of the original model with Martin Seligman. This actually came out of the Myers-Briggs Company's 3-year study into well-being in the workplace. And what this is about is it's about when you have feelings of anxiety or you're pessimistic or you're depressed, and very specifically, the factor of frequency of being in these states of emotion. So again, it's not the opposite of positive emotions, but it's rather the frequency with which you experience negative emotional experiences. Here, I have to give a little shout out to my own puppy, because there was a few years ago where I went through, and I think you can all relate, something happens in your life at some point, and it's some kind of a major event enough that you experience a surge of negative emotions. And I became surprised the other day as I thought back that when I rescued Dixie in 2015, I had no idea at that time, as a first-time dog owner, that when I was going to face a very difficult season of my life, she was going to become sort of my well-being champion. So I thought I'd include her in there just to give her a little bit of a shout out. So that's basically this PREMAN model that we wanted to introduce you to. Keep this model in mind as Rich walks us through the data. It's going to give you kind of a context or an infrastructure on which to pin your findings and what you find that resonates and is interesting. And here, what I'd like to just kind of ask you is, imagine that we were having a one-on-one conversation right now, totally private, and it's just you and I were to ask you, which aspect of well-being is highest for you? Now that we just went through each of these, think about that. We're not going to share that. But also another way that you might reflect on this at this juncture is think about what are the opportunities and experiences that you have at work, at home, and maybe even during play that seem to affect these most for you, because those could be powerful indicators for you of sort of the keys to your own well-being. Let's also take it up a notch to the organizational level. In what ways is your organization supporting staff well-being as defined by this model? And then a tandem question that I never leave out there is, does that support reach all levels of staff at the organization? I think that's critical, because I think that there's a gap in organizations in terms of the level of investment in employees that are given to higher up leaders of the organization that the rest of the staff, ends up receiving. So I think it's a very important question to ask in that sort of dual format. Again, think about these things and give it some thought. We at the Myers-Briggs Company, and specifically my team, our consultants, are increasingly looking for ways to be able to support employees and to support talent development efforts and help employees self-optimize, thrive, help promote their well-being. And we do this through partnership with organizations. We do this through formal learning and development experiences where we help employees build their own self-awareness of their personality styles. What are your strengths? What are your talents? How can you find more opportunities at work to do the things that make you feel like you're in flow? And then how do you appreciate others and appreciate those differences so that you can have stronger relationships? How can you flex your own go-to style as a gift for others to be able to build those stronger working relationships? And then we also get called on sometimes to be able to help people managers and organizations support people through major times of change. You remember we talked earlier, organizations are going through constant change, and change is a psychological experience. It hits us in a profound way that needs to be supported. And then of course, also we do things around trust, because well-being has a lot to do with trust. If I don't trust somebody, my relationship will suffer for that. And we do that in quite a bit of means. You might do some of this yourself as internal practitioners too. We do it through one-on-one coaching and assessment debriefs, executive coaching, group-based workshops. We do it through developing full leadership programs and also developing other practitioners in the use of assessments that can help inform somebody's well-being. So what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to actually pass it on to my colleague and ask him to take us through some very interesting and compelling research on this model that we looked at.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Just so you know, folks, we're transitioning from Rachel presenting to me, so I'm just trying to make sure I can make the slides advance. So here we go. So again, thank you for being here. Rachel, great job of setting up the model that we use at the Myers-Briggs Company to look at workplace well-being and also why it matters for organizations. What I'm going to do is walk you through some research that we've been doing for the last few years on well-being, and hopefully answer some key questions that we identified and worked through over the last few years. So briefly, the first question we had is, can we measure this effectively internationally? We do a lot of measurement in Western cultures, but we wanted to go beyond that. Over the years, different questions have come up in terms of gender, age, occupation level, or level of job, and their impact on well-being. And of course, because we're the Myers-Briggs Company, we also wanted to look at personality. We also wanted to ask about workplace activities that might be effective for enhancing well-being, along with some questions about leisure activities. And then I'll talk you briefly through a model for what individuals and organizations can do to enhance their well-being at work. So to answer the questions that we posed, we've actually conducted a global survey in the years 16, 17, and 18, always in the same time frame of May, June. In that survey, we had our measures of workplace well-being, which is 28 items. And then in the first year, in 2016, we asked a series of general questions about what you do to improve your well-being, and we adopted those from the Australian Psychological Society that they had been using in Australia. And then in 2017 and 18, we asked those life questions again, but we also asked some work activities questions to try to get more information about what people can do at work. And in my presentation, I'm just going to walk you through the results from some of these different questions that we asked. But keep in mind that the data is typically from all 3 years combined, except for when I'm pulling out and looking at trends. So like a good researcher, I need a little commentary on the sample. So we primarily went to people who had previously completed the MBTI and asked them to participate in this research. For all I know, some of you might have participated in that. And you can see that our sample is primarily female. We find this in most of the work that we do. Females just tend to participate in research more often than males. The average age is 43 years. And most of our sample comes from the higher level ONET categories, if you're familiar with those, of education, training, and library services, management, business, and financial operations, to a lesser extent, some support operations. And for those of you familiar with ONET, the ones that you're not seeing here, those higher level occupational categories, they were all less than 1% of those, and they're down here in the other category. So the point is, we're doing a fairly good job of representing more white-collar occupations in a variety of different places. And like I said, we did do this globally. So we took a question we had about where you are located on the planet and put people into regions, because otherwise it became pretty hard to look at all of that. You'll notice that our sample is primarily in North America, and within that, it's primarily the United States. Australia and New Zealand is our second largest sample, and again, that's driven by a colleague of mine we've been working with in Australia. And then the next largest is, interestingly, Asia, and those folks are primarily from South Korea, Singapore, and southern China, where we have different distributors who work with us on that. And finally, the next largest sample is Europe. So basically, we have data from all of the, almost every country in the world. Primarily the African data, for example, is primarily from Southern Africa, and so on and so forth. So is it a great representative sample? No, but we do have input from all over the planet in terms of people's well-being. Answering our first question, can we do it? And the answer is yes. So transitioning from that to the kind of overall summary of what we've seen for the last few years, and I have to manage the time, folks. I might go fast on some of these slides. But for all of these slides, we break it out following our model, so the stuff that Rachel's already talked to you about, and then we include this overall measure of well-being, which is just the average or the aggregate of these other measures, where negative emotions in that case is reverse scored, otherwise it would drag down the overall score. Remember, low scores on negative emotions are good. And you can see that we see a fairly stable pattern over the last 3 years. First of all, 2016 tended to be the highest, 2017 the lowest, 2018 a certain amount of recovery. Globally, thinking about it, there were some, if you want to go back in your Wayback Machine, in 2016 we had some fairly contentious elections in the U.S. and in France. There's also the Brexit vote, so that might have impacted some of these drops, given that we had a lot of our sample from those areas. But it's also very possible, I don't want to overinterpret this, that it just could be, measurement error, because we have different samples in each of these years. But I think the key takeaway from this slide and this summary is that workplace well-being tends to be pretty stable, and more importantly, it tends to be pretty high. So we're on a 1 to 10 point scale, and we're in that 7.5 range. So clearly there's some room for improvement, but it's not as if everything is really terrible either. When we look at it by region, we see consistent results over the years. Australia and New Zealand is always the highest. Latin America is the second highest. For those of us in North America, we are towards the bottom of the pack. Similar for our friends in Europe. So some of the more advanced, industrialized countries that have been, doing this sort of work for many, many years tend to not do as well. The Asian numbers I found interesting and somewhat surprising. I expected Asia to be a little bit higher than that. I did talk to some people I know in Singapore, and they said, nope, that makes perfect sense to us. We're a region of the world where well-being is not as important as it is in some other places. So you see some differences. They're not huge, and again, the takeaway is well-being's pretty good around the globe, but there are some small differences. So one of the other questions that came up as we've worked with this over the years is, well, what about the function of age? So here you can see overall well-being is at the bottom, and then the model, all the elements of the model going down. And the overall takeaway is that, so the bottom bar is the 18 to 24s, the top bar is the 65 pluses. The overall takeaway is that well-being tends to improve with age. You'll notice here, for example, that positive emotions seem to go up as you get older, but not super fast, whereas engagement and meaning seem to accelerate much more quickly than some of the other elements of the model as people get older. If you think about that, that makes good sense. You get a job when you get out of college or out of high school. You know, you're happy to have a job. Then you start looking for maybe a better job that's more engaging or provides more meaning or a better fit for the things that you care about. And so we see that fairly, substantial increase as people age, and it sort of makes sense as you think about people searching for jobs and finding better fit and understanding themselves better. And then for emotion, I think it's an interesting pattern that you see a fairly nice gain in positive emotion in the early years, and then it sort of stabilizes. Whereas you see just the opposite in negative emotion. So the top bar is the 65 plus, and they have the lowest level of negative emotions. You kind of think about it going backwards, those seem to decrease more rapidly as you get older, with younger people having the most negative emotions and the fewest positive emotions, for example. So when we look at the totality here, it's emotions and managing your emotions that seems to be an area, especially for younger people, where there is a lot of opportunity for improvement in well-being, and maybe some of the things that go on at work that impact their emotions is another area where we might be able to do some improvement. I had a lady in a session I was presenting on ask about gender, and I said, well, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about that. So this summarizes, again, kind of following that same approach, the overall well-being for gender. You'll notice a couple things here. Generally speaking, the smallest difference is in relationships, both men and women. They tend to report their relationships as a key element of their well-being and one of the highest levels of their well-being. And interestingly enough, for engagement, men are much lower, relatively speaking, than women in terms of their engagement element of the model. And another interesting outcome is the impact of the gender on positive and negative emotions. You'll notice that females tend to report both more positive and more negative emotions, and that's really the only place where we see that gender flip. I was talking to someone at a conference once, and it was a woman, and she said, well, that's just because women experience more emotions. And I said, that makes sense to me, and since you're a woman, you can say that. I wouldn't say that as a guy, but it sort of makes sense. So again, not huge differences in gender, but we do see some patterns. Men tend to be a little bit lower than women. And then, of course, we have to look at personality types since we are the MBTI company. And I'm just going to point out a few things that are of interest here. First of all, you'll notice when we look at the gray bars, which is the overall level of well-being, it's lower for people who have these introversion preferences than for people who have extroversion preferences. We see that both in MBTI personality results as well as Big Five personality results. If you are someone who tends to be more introverted, you tend to have lower levels of well-being. That also holds up for life satisfaction and satisfaction in general. There is a bit of a burden, if you will, of being an introvert. You'll also notice a couple of things here. So the negative emotions and the positive emotions follow that pattern. Introverts experience more negative emotions and fewer positive emotions compared to extroverts who report fewer negative emotions and more positive emotions. For those of you who have a TJ preference, you'll notice that Positive emotions, engagement, and meaning tend to converge for the TJs. They do it right here, and then here, right here. So for those people, most everybody else, relationship seems to be the number one thing. But for the TJs, relationships, engagement, accomplishment all sort of just go together as one thing. And then you also notice if you look at the people with a feeling preference, they tend to report higher levels of positive well-being in terms of relationships. Interestingly enough, ISTPs, which happens to be my type, report the lowest level of overall well-being, and ENFPs and ENTJs report the overall highest level of well-being. And again, on a 10-point scale, that's about a 1-point difference, so we can maybe call that a 10% difference in terms of the lowest to the highest level of well-being just based on personality type alone. And another amusing kind of thing is my partner in crime, who often presents this with me, Rachel's doing a great job, but Martin from Australia, he just happens to be an ENFP, and I happen to be an ISTP, so we represent kind of both extremes of well-being based on type. And then looking at occupation groups, and I'm going to have to move it along because we're going to run out of time. We'll notice a couple things here. There are differences in occupation. They are fairly large, about 1.2 on that 10-point scale. And helping occupations seem to have higher levels of well-being than more hands-on occupations. And we see that pattern across the globe. And that just perhaps has something to do with the different things that they do at work, whether it's the meaning or the engagement or what have you. This is overall well-being here. And then finally, on this bit, we've asked people over the years to just tell us what things seem to have a positive impact on their well-being. Like I said, we measure some leisure or general activities and work activities. I won't read all of these, but we do tend to see very consistent results over time. There's some social activities, some cognitive activities, some individual and maybe group activities that tend to be more positive, and those happen both at work and at home. And then we also have looked at how these correlate. So another way of looking at this is how these correlate with actual overall well-being. So similar things to what's on the prior slide. But for example, and I'll just talk about this very briefly, we see that there's a fairly decent large correlation between overall well-being and when people indicate what I do is focus on a task that makes me feel positive. So some of that cognitive, stuff that they're doing. Interestingly enough, maybe not good for those of us in HR, but the undertaking training for professional development is one of the lower correlations that we saw. However, I want to point out it's still positive, it still has an impact, it's just not as big of an impact as some of these things over here. And then we also have collected, I guess you might say, so what, well-being's nice and all that. The last year we did this survey, we collected a bunch of organizational outcome data and correlated that with well-being. And here you see that for people who have higher levels of overall well-being, they tend to report a much higher level of job satisfaction. They tend to engage in more organizational OCBs or what we call organizational citizenship behaviors, meaning they do things that are outside of their job purview to help the organization, to help other individuals in the organization. They tend to be more committed. And similarly, and Rachel alluded to this before, when people have lower levels of well-being, they tend to be more inclined to leave the organization. So if you can manage well-being within an organization, help people really, be the best person they can be, there are some positives for the organization as a whole. So I'm going to quickly walk you through a model that we're using with some customers in an attempt to help them manage and improve the well-being of their workforce. And of course, it starts with evaluating where you're at. So we talk about doing an audit or a survey, finding out what are the things that are going on in your organization, what is their current state in terms of well-being, what are the other, beyond the survey, just what are the things that are positive and negative within that organization. And then we help them to figure out what are some of the things that they might be able to do we have data on a host of different activities that people say are helpful and work for them. And we ask the organization to then go through that and figure out what makes the most sense, implement some of those, and then do an evaluation at the end to say, well, what kind of impact did we have? The reason that we do talk about the personality data and the gender and the age and some of that stuff is that a lot of organizations will do these kinds of surveys and then come up with, here's some one-size-fits-all recommendations. And it's the reason for the type data, the age data, the gender data is that there are not necessarily one thing that will work best for everyone. Having some of that more individual level information of what works for this person, this type, might make these efforts more effective. And then really quickly, so that's for the organization. So what are some of the things that you can do? Rachel's already kind of walked through some of those 6 questions and some of the things that people have. But you can spend some time thinking about what can I do to improve my well-being knowing that I have this model. Briefly, so from the question 6, what are some of the things that have a negative effect on your well-being personally, both at work and at home, and what can you do to minimize those? Or what can you do to help the well-being of your family, friends, and colleagues, knowing something about this model, having a conversation with them about trying to figure out what to do? And then I've gone very quickly through our research, but we do have a summary of the work that we've done over that 3-year period, along with some type-specific recommendations that we can share with you. And so very quickly, just maybe stop and think for a moment about what is the one thing from what we've talked about here that you might be able to do to improve your well-being at work, and what is the one thing you might be able to do to improve your well-being outside of work. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. Hopefully you can come up with some actions and jot them down. We talked about doing a Q&A, but I am out of time, so we won't do that here. And while you're thinking, I'm just going to press on. Here's some things that you might think about. These are the same list that I had before, but now that we've contextualized it a little bit, let you look at that. Think about some things that you can do. These were the global #1s for work and the global #1s for outside of work. Again, a lot of it can be cognitive. Some of it can be spending time with other people. Some of it can be just, working on finding activities that you enjoy that allow you to kind of, decompress a little bit. And you see a lot of that on the outside of work activities. And like I said, we have a report that we can make available to you. We go through a lot of what's in this presentation in terms of what is well-being, how we define it, the background on the research, some of the things we found, advice for well-being at work, both from a type perspective as well as just in general. And we can make that report available to people if they are interested. So just to wrap up really quick, we saw that, in the work there's a lot of positive effects for well-being for people in general. We know that it's impacted by age, job, where you are in the world. We know that there's some introversion and extroversion differences, and we have a lot of different research projects going on in this topic. And if someone's interested in learning more about their own organization's well-being, I'm going to be very brief here. One of the projects we have is to try to get additional data from more broad organizations. So if anyone's interested in collecting data from their organization using our survey, let us know, and I'll give you an email address in a little bit. And we have a process where we administer, kind of go through the questions, provide a report and some interpretation, and then recommendations based on research for those who want to participate in that project. You can reach out to me at research@themyersbriggs.com. So hopefully easy to remember, and since I am way out of time, I'm going to flip it over to questions.
Thank you, Rich and Rachel. That was an amazing presentation with so many insights, and I know we're running close on time, and I just wanted to share with everybody within the next few days, the Myers-Briggs Company will be sending out an email with the slides, this recording, along with the full well-being report that Rich had mentioned. And I'm hopeful to squeeze in at least one really good question. Mariana asks, with regards to reminding ourselves why our work is important, Would you say leaders have a role to play here? And if so, what kinds of leadership might be contributing to well-being at work more than others?
That is a fantastic question, and I don't have data to support this, but I would make the argument that if you're familiar with the transformational, transactional kind of leadership model, visionary leaders, the more transformational leaders, the people who inspire others, get them, motivated and excited to do the things that they need to do, are likely to have a more positive effect on well-being than the more transactional, you do this, quid pro quo type manager. That would be my guess. We haven't looked at that, but you've just given me a great idea for an additional research project, so thank you.
All right, and let's see if we could do one or two more questions. I see engagement as part of your model. How does that differ from what we might get in an engagement survey?
Yeah, so we do include elements of engagement in our model, and to not make the questionnaire too long, we have an overall measure of engagement. People who are doing, there's a lot of organizations who do engagement surveys or job satisfaction surveys already, and the question is, what's one more survey going to do? You might be able to get guidance from that in terms of those other surveys, in terms of what you might do about well-being. But I think that within our approach allows you to really have that more individual focus. A lot of job satisfaction engagement surveys are really about the benefits of changing things for the organization. The focus of the well-being survey and our recommendations are really about the person, the employee. And there's some nice benefits that maybe come to the organization, but it's really that switch in focus that I think is crucial and relevant to what we do.
Okay, and Stephanie asks, is employee well-being synonymous to employee satisfaction?
They are highly, highly related, but they are not the same thing exactly. Like I showed that correlation, it was very high. So people who have higher well-being are going to be more satisfied, but there are different elements of things that go into job satisfaction than go into workplace well-being or well-being in general. What exactly those are, we haven't fully teased out yet, but I think my comment on the prior question about the focus is maybe a key one, in that the well-being work that we do is really focused on the individuals and what's best for that person, whereas job satisfaction stuff tends to be more focused on what's best for the organization.
Okay, and I'm going to leave us with one more good question. I think we could do this within the next 2 minutes. There are not large differences in the different MBTI types in terms of their well-being. How does type help then?
So you are right. What we see in the organizations we've measured so far, generally pretty high levels of well-being. There's a standard deviation around that. We have had people who've reported 10s, and we have had people who've reported 1s, so there's variability. What we found in other work that we didn't report here is that the different MBTI types tend to often say similar things. I do this to improve my well-being. I do that to improve my well-being. Some other work that we've done, we haven't fully summarized it yet, is that, not unexpectedly, they go about doing those things differently. An example, both introverts and extroverts will say, I spend time with other people. When we did the qualitative evaluation, asked people some questions about that, a big takeaway, thinking about ENFPs, for instance, versus ISTPs, picking on me and Martin, Martin said, yeah, I like to spend time with people, and I don't care who they are, it's anyone. Whereas I, as an ISTP, said, yes, I like to spend time with people, but there's 2 of them. A lot fewer people, a lot narrower range of people I want to interact with. So there's some qualitative and how you do it differences based on type, rather than the quantitative differences that we talked about.
All right. Well, thank you, Rich, and again, Rachel. We're against the hour, and thank you, everyone, for participating in this webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
On behalf of HR.com, I'd really like to thank our great presenters today, and of course our sponsor, the Myers-Briggs Company, for sharing their insights with our audience today. And thank you to the audience for joining and for participating. We will be sending you an email with your credit information. You'll also find the credits on your View My Credits page of your membership profile once the webcast has been archived. Did you know that our free members now have unlimited access to watch all of our live and archived webcasts and virtual events? Free members can collect up to 5 HRCI and SHRM credits each month. If you watch more than 5 webcasts in a month, your credits will be banked. To unlock and redeem your credits, please upgrade to our recertification program. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. I also included a link in the Zoom chat. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.